I'd like to tell you a little story about my grandfather. Dominic Mercadante grew up in the Puglia region in southern Italy. When World War I flared up, he went off to fight for Italy, and during the course of the war, he ended up under siege as a POW. As my dad liked to tell the story, at some point, all they had to eat and drink were rats and vermouth. My grandfather survived the war, and when he returned home, he found his family impoverished. Not speaking a word of English and barely having 2 pennies to rub together, my grandfather boarded a boat for New York City. And on the boat, he met a man who said he could try to get him a job at a piano factory. When they landed in America, my grandfather took that job at the factory and worked hard to teach himself English and save some money. A few years later, despite never having driven a trolley in his life, he took a job driving trolleys in New York City. And years later, when they switched to buses, he taught himself to drive those as well. He didn't let the fact that he had never driven a vehicle in his entire life stop him. Along the way, he met my grandmother and had 2 kids, my father and my Aunt Rose. And despite living on a trolley and bus driver's salary, my grandfather saved his money and put my father through the University of Notre Dame. I tell you this story because my grandfather's story has always been an inspiration to me. He passed away when I was only a year old, but his story has been a big part of my life. You see, when people with 6-figure salaries come to me and tell me that they're too fearful, too busy, or have too much adversity in their life to pursue their dreams, I think of my grandfather. He had every excuse in the world to fail. He could have avoided all the jobs he took in America by saying he didn't speak the language and didn't have the experience. But you see, my grandfather and my parents grew up in an era when we were allowed to fail. He didn't grow up in a security bubble. He didn't grow up learning to get trophies just for showing up. He didn't grow up in a society where we tried to suck every last aspect of risk out of our lives and cities close community pools and make it illegal for kids to climb trees for fear that someone might get injured. He grew up in an era when going for the win wasn't stigmatized as a bad thing and in which he was allowed to sink or swim, allowed to fail so he could learn, dust himself off, and get back in the game. So my message to you today is this: rip yourself out of your security bubble. Tear yourself out of your comfort zone of misery. Don't be afraid to risk. Don't be afraid to fail. Because if you fail, at least you fail doing something you love instead of being stuck in your current rut. And I don't say all of this to compare my grandfather's adversity to yours, but I will say this: there are those who thrive despite their circumstances. There are those who thrive because of their circumstances. And there are those who use their circumstances as an excuse to not even get in the game. And so I ask you, what type of person are you?